Hi, everyone. Welcome to the What is Belief seminar series. I'm here with my co-host, Tanya Lombroso, and we are delighted today to have cognitive scientist Hugo Mercier. The What is Belief seminar series is generously funded by the John Templeton Foundation, so thanks to our sponsors. Hugo Mercier is a research scientist at CNRS, that's the National Research Center of France, and he is housed at Institut Jean Nicode in Paris. He's a world expert on reasoning and processes of communication. He wrote a book with Dan Sperber called The Enigma of Reason, which made a big splash. And I can also recommend his more recent book, Not Born Yesterday. It's really a lovely read and you'll learn a lot from it. So thank you for being here, Hugo. And just to the people who are participating in the audience, you will have a chance to ask questions. Tanya will be fielding the questions, and the way that works is you type them in the chat box, and then we will allow you to speak, or we'll just read the questions out. So without further ado, let's all welcome Hugo Mercier.
Thank you so much, Neil. Thank you, Tanya, for the invitation. It's really an honor to be part of the seminar. So I will start sharing my screen now. Okay, it's all working fine. So it seems. So this talk is kind of loosely based on a paper that was co-written with Sacha Altay, my former PhD student, now a postdoc in Oxford. And I will talk mostly about cultural misbeliefs. Oh, sorry. So what do I mean by cultural misbeliefs? Well, misbeliefs, I rely on the kind of old definition by Ryan McKay and Dan Dennett, essentially false beliefs or beliefs that are, at least partially false. And by cultural, I mean a belief that is relatively widespread. So if you're just mistaken about something completely on your own, that I'm less interested. And more importantly, beliefs that have spread through, or at least in part through communication. So, if many people in the world independently form the idea that the Earth is flat, that would not be a cultural misbelief. That would just be people having intuition that the world looks flat. But if many people believe that vaccines cause autism, presumably it is because other people have told them so. And so we would have a cultural misbelief. So my target here really are these cultural misbeliefs, these misbeliefs that are widespread in the population and that spread through communication. So these types of beliefs have attracted in cognitive science and in the social sciences more generally a lot of interest. There is the cognitive science of religion, which has studied a lot religious misbeliefs, beliefs in ancestors, in witches, in gods. There is a long-standing tradition in social psychology of studying rumors and quack medicine. And more recently, there has been a lot of work in psychology in particular on conspiracy theories and fake news. So why do cultural misbeliefs attract so much attention? Well, I think one factor is that they're kind of fun, they're kind of intrinsically interesting objects for people who don't believe in them. But something else that matters a lot, and that I think matters a lot in grant applications, for instance, is can be summarized by this famous Voltaire quote that whoever can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. I'm putting the picture of the translator here because it doesn't read quite the same in French, but anyway. So for instance, the cognitive science of religion has also investigated the potentially problematic movements of radicalism and other types of costly religious behaviors. People who study rumors have investigated ethnic riots. So it's well known that ethnic riots are nearly always preceded by rumors accusing the victims or the future victims of atrocities, for instance. Quack medicine has been linked to anti-vaccination. So people who believe then again that vaccines cause autism will then engage in costly behavior of not vaccinating themselves and their children. Conspiracy theories can lead people to, or can seemingly lead people to do a lot of crazy stuff, like burning 5G towers in England. And fake news has been accused of leading to things, described as being bad for people, like electing Donald Trump or voting for Brexit. And I think, a lot of the appeal of the study of these cultural misbeliefs is that it looks as if they are causing a lot of extremely kind of socially and personally costly behaviors. So, and it looks plausible. I mean, we see these people engaging in costly behaviors. We see, and they profess holding misbeliefs that relate to these costly behaviors, like someone who says, well, I'm not vaccinating my kids because I think it's going to make them autistic. And it is obviously true that as a rule, beliefs tend to guide our actions. That's the function of beliefs. That's what they're for. And so I think the implicit or oftentimes explicit model that a lot of people have is that cultural misbeliefs tend to cause costly behavior, and that's one of the reasons we should study them and fight against them. So my argument here will be that this is mostly mistaken, and that indeed, as a rule, it is much more likely that costly behaviors cause the adoption of misbeliefs rather than the other way around. So here is how my argument is going to proceed. First, I will explain how is it even possible for beliefs not to cause behaviors. Then I will review some evidence that cultural misbeliefs indeed do not cause the costly behaviors they are associated with. So you will see it's a little bit hand-wavy, that section, but I think there's a lot of suggestive evidence. And then very, very briefly, I will just hint at some answers as to why we might have cultural misbeliefs if they do not cause these costly behaviors. So first, how is it possible for beliefs not to cause behaviors? So here I will be essentially summarizing an old paper by Dan Sperber, which I think is really like a very, very, very important paper called Intuitive and Reflective Beliefs, and published 25 years ago. So it starts from the observation that all beliefs, or probably all beliefs in non-human animals and most beliefs in humans, are held intuitively. So what he calls intuitive beliefs. Intuitive beliefs are beliefs that are free to interact with our inferential and practical cognitive mechanisms. So for instance, all or nearly all the beliefs form through perception or through simple testimony. So my wife told me earlier that she would be coming back at about 4, at my time. And so I can, base my behavior on this. I know when to expect her. I know what to expect. I can draw inferences. I can do all sorts of things with that belief because it is held intuitively. I just, intuitively believe she will come back. However, we also know that humans are special in a number of ways. And one of the ways in which they are special is that they can hold reflective, non-critical attitudes. So we can entertain beliefs without believing in them. So this is quite trivial in the case of when we attribute false beliefs. So for instance, you can know that Phoebe doesn't love Samantha, but you can think that Samantha believes Phoebe loves her. So it's one of the main things that has been studied under the umbrella of theory of mind. And it's quite well established. It's trivially true in adults, but it's quite well established that even small children can entertain these kind of false beliefs. And indeed, if we couldn't do that, we couldn't have theory of mind, we couldn't have communication. People would get constantly confused by attributing false beliefs to others. So what is less trivial, and that Dan points out in that paper, is that we can also have reflective, critical attitudes. So we can believe in something reflectively. So there's a series of examples. Peter is sincere when he says that he's in pain. I remember that the day we first met, it was raining. It is a scientific fact that a glass of wine a day is good for the heart. I don't think this is actually a scientific fact, but it's just an example. That the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost are one is a holy mystery. So in all of these cases, people don't simply believe that, for instance, Peter is in pain. They hold a more complex, reflective attitude towards the fact that he's in pain. They say that Peter is sincere when he says that he is in pain. So we know that it's an observation that humans are able to do that. And typically, when you have a critical attitude towards something, that will lead to forming an intuitive belief. So for instance, if you believe that Peter is sincere when he says that he is in pain, then you will form the intuitive belief that Peter is in pain, and then you know what to do with this. You know that you might, if you like Peter, you will try to succor him, to help him, to bring him paracetamol or whatever. And so that is typically what happens when you have critical attitudes. You just end up with a reflective belief, with an intuitive belief. However, and it's one of the main points of the paper, this is not always the case. So, for instance, someone who believes that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost are one, that they are one is a holy mystery, or someone who believes that relativity theory is widely accepted by physicists, they hold reflective, critical attitudes towards the beliefs. But the point is that presumably they can't actually turn the belief, for instance, that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost are one, or that relativity theory is correct. They can't turn that into an intuitive belief. And they can't do that because they do not have intuitive concepts. They don't have kind of, basic concepts that they could rely on in order to understand things like the Holy Trinity or things like relativity theory. And as a result, they don't know what kind of inferences or what kind of behaviors or thoughts or emotions should follow from these concepts. And so even though people have a critical attitudes towards the Holy Trinity or relativity theory, these remain what Dan calls reflective beliefs. And so the point is that people can have reflective beliefs. So you genuinely believe in something. So I genuinely believe in relativity theory. I have no doubt about relativity theory. And yet my believing in relativity theory has really like no effect on my thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, because I don't know what to do with that belief. And if I were a physicist, I would be able to draw some inferences, for instance, but I don't know what to do with it. In the same way as presumably most Christians don't really know what to do with the belief of in the Holy Trinity. So that's kind of, so far that's kind of Dan's argument. And some of these examples have been studied. Actually, by the way, so it's very reminiscent of Neil's argument about factual and religious beliefs. So the factual beliefs are intuitive beliefs, and some of the religious beliefs would be reflective beliefs. An example that has been well studied empirically is the belief that God is omnipresent, omniscient, and omnipotent. And we know that Christians who have been taught about that, if you ask them, is God omnipresent? They can say, well, yes, God is omnipresent. But there has, been some very clever experiments showing that, in fact, people tend to think of God as being essentially an agent with limited attention, somewhat limited powers, etc. And so, even though people have the reflective belief that God is, Christians have the reflective belief that God is omnipresent, omniscient, and omnipotent, etc., that belief remains reflective, and intuitively they think of God in a quite different manner. So that's kind of that's where the argument, kind of Dan's argument stops. And the thing I want to discuss are cases that are a bit different, cases such that everyone knows that Barack Obama is a Muslim, or reliable sources agree that high-level Democrats are abusing children. So what I find interesting about these cases is that they have, so in both cases we have a critical attitude. So people, you should believe you should believe that Obama is a Muslim, or that high-level Democrats are abusing children. But the concepts that are involved are quite intuitive. So if you're prejudiced against Muslims, we know what to think about Muslims, how to deal with them, what kind of emotions they might trigger. So there's nothing hard in thinking that Barack Obama is a Muslim. Likewise, if you are shown, for instance, footage, or if you witness yourself someone abusing a child, you have a whole lot of cognitive mechanisms that will be triggered, that will trigger behaviors and thoughts and emotions towards the person who is abusing the children. So there's nothing hard to understand about someone being a Muslim or about someone abusing children. It's not like the case of the Holy Trinity or relativity theory, which are intrinsically complex and abstruse concepts. Here, it's all completely transparent and simple. So we have critical attitudes, we have intuitive concepts, and yet the argument that I will be making here is that these beliefs remain reflective, and they do not have the kind of behavioral, emotional, or kind of cognitive consequences that they would have if people held the very same beliefs intuitively. So that's just to show you that it's in principle possible. So we know that people have reflective beliefs. We know. I think we can make a good argument anyway that in some domains, at least, people have reflective beliefs that don't really impact their thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And so the argument I'm going to make now is more of an empirical argument, suggesting that many cultural misbeliefs are indeed of that nature. So what kind of evidence can we muster that cultural misbeliefs are reflective beliefs, and they don't really cause most of the costly behaviors they tend to be associated with? So one of the so that's I'm gonna look broadly at two types of evidence. The first type of evidence is that the cultural misbelief we're interested in, they do not trigger the kind of behaviors, thoughts, or emotions that should be triggered if the belief were held intuitively. And on the contrary, that they trigger other behaviors, thoughts, or emotions that are typically not triggered if the belief is held intuitively. So there's a dissociation between the kind of consequences that holding the belief reflectively has versus the kind of consequences that holding the belief intuitively has. So I'll give you a few examples to try to kind of flesh that out a little bit. And one I really like is the examples of conspiracies, like actual conspiracies versus conspiracy theories, which are kind of nearly by definition false. So what happens when people have an intuitive belief in conspiracy? So what does it mean to have an intuitive belief in conspiracy? This has been studied by people who look at whistleblowers, for instance. And so, you're in a large company or in a branch of the government, and you realize that your boss is hiding documents. You realize that there are some shady going on, some numbers are being fudged, et cetera, et cetera. And so you see that with your own eyes, or you're being told by someone you can trust, like the accountant or something. And so what happens to these people who form an intuitive belief that there is something shady going on in their organization? They tend to be afraid. They tend to be afraid for their position, sometimes for their lives in the most extreme cases. They try to hide the fact that they know anything. That's really kind of their first reaction, is they don't want people to know that they know. And indeed, it's extremely hard to get these people to talk. You need to have a whole lot of legal protections to make sure that whistleblowers can speak their mind and can reveal the conspiracy they have witnessed. Like, it's really hard to get these sort of things to surface. So this is quite the typical pattern when people have formed an intuitive belief that there is a conspiracy going on. By contrast, when people have a reflective belief that there's a conspiracy going on, so when people believe in a conspiracy, or what I think is a reflective belief in a conspiracy theory, that that Democrats are abusing children, that you can name hundreds of them, they tend to make so either it triggers like no emotion at all, or if it triggers any emotion, it's going to make them angry. They tend not to hide their view. So if you ask them, do you believe that that the Democrats are doing this? Oh yes, no, it's horrible. They will say that to pollsters. They will say that to their neighbors, to their family, and indeed, in some cases, they will be very public. They will have blogs and YouTube videos, and they will go to conferences saying that the NSA and the CIA are responsible for 9/11 and these sort of things. And so I think that there's a very, very clear contrast between the kind of emotions, thoughts, and behaviors that are triggered when people form an intuitive belief in a conspiracy because they themselves, for instance, have witnessed something like, oh God, that guy who is in Russia now. Anyway, versus what happens when people have a reflective belief in conspiracies. And so another way of illustrating that with a very kind of concrete example is what happened during the Pizzagate conspiracy theory craze. So that was in the 2016, I think, presidential election between Trump and Clinton. And so the conspiracy was that the conspiracy theory was that high-level Democrats were abusing children, inter alia, in the basement of a pizzeria in the suburbs of DC. And according to polls at the time, something like nearly half of Americans, or at least half of Republicans and even some Democrats, thought that something like this was going on, that there was something true about Pizzagate. So we're talking about potentially dozens of millions of people. And one of the reasons that this specific conspiracy theory became so famous, is that this one guy, Edgar Madison Welsh, decided to take his truck and his gun from Virginia to DC, and he stormed the pizzeria. He fired a few shots into the ceiling to try to get them to open the non-existent basement holding non-existent children. And presumably, this guy might actually have held an intuitive belief that this was happening. And so, I mean, if you take his perspective, if he genuinely intuitively believed that children were being tortured and abused in that place, and that the police was too corrupt to do anything about it, then trying to free them by force is actually the right thing to do. Like, he was being coherent. By contrast, what the vast majority of the people have done is really kind of expressing themselves about the conspiracy theory. Like this one guy who wrote a 1-star review of the pizzeria, saying that the pizzas were incredibly undercooked, and that suspicious professionally dressed men by the bar area that looked like regulars kept staring at my son and other kids in the place, definitely not coming back, beginning to think the conspiracies about this place are true. So I don't know how much I have to drive home how crazy it is to do that. Like, you go to a place that you suspect, in which you suspect pedophiles are active. You bring your kids, and then you write a 1-star review that starts by noting that the pizza is undercooked. Like, it's just, it makes no sense whatsoever. And that is what most people who did something about Pizzagate did. They just talked about it. And so that's what presumably this guy had a reflective belief that the conspiracies were true. And this is, I mean, someone else who has really pointed that out is the author of a book about the 9/11 truthers, who notes that people who believe that 9/11 was orchestrated by the Bush administration or the CIA or whomever else, who believe that there are these kind of super powerful nefarious organizations that they can kill thousands of people without suffering any blame. They can kill whoever they want, and these people say that out loud, which really makes no sense whatsoever. Like, if you're in Pakistan and you believe that the ISI, the local CIA is evil, you say nothing because they will kill you. Another example that has been well studied is that of the belief that Barack Obama is a Muslim. So there's been a great study by Kim and Kim that looked at kind of the antecedents and the precedents of that specific rumor, or we would call that a fake news now. So what they showed through like a panel study is that, unsurprisingly, the people who are the most likely to come to believe that, so those in 2008 in the last campaign of Obama, the people who are the most likely to believe that that Obama is a Muslim are those who already disliked Obama a lot. But what they also show is that accepting that Barack Obama is a Muslim has no effect on these people's attitudes towards Obama or on their voting intentions. And so what seems to be happening is that if you dislike Obama, then you're going to accept a variety of false things about him. But if you are being coherent, if you're prejudiced against Muslims, and all of a sudden you learn that on top of everything else, Barack Obama is a Muslim, then that should make you even less likely to vote for him. That should make you like him even less. And we don't see that. Another example, pretty dreadful one, and I mentioned earlier. So it's quite well established that before ethnic riots, so when two ethnic groups fighting each other, and typically one of them just massacring, engaging in genocide against the other, and it's more or less large scale, you have rumors of atrocities that circulate. So the other group, they've poisoned the wells, they've raped the women, they've killed our children, etc., etc. And one of the most famous, if not the most famous example of that, is the example of ritual murders. The blood libel that has been attributed to Jews at least since the Middle Ages, maybe even since Roman times. So that's William of Norwich, when a child who was supposedly killed by Jews in like 13th century England. And that's kind of the revival of that legend in medieval times. And so then again, we have a case in which, and then obviously oftentimes after, when people engage in pogroms and other forms of ethnic attacks, they will cite these kind of rumors as a, as a cause for their exactions. But then again, I think we have a pretty striking contrast between what happens when people have an intuitive belief that someone has committed some crime versus someone having a reflective belief. So we know from studies in kind of legal anthropology and other fields that what happens when people believe that a crime has been committed in a kind of small scale society or in a kind of pre-modern society, people will do something about it. Clearly, they will always, there will be some repercussions for the person who committed if the crime is severe enough, something will happen. Typically, people will show quite a lot of restraint. So it's not going to be an immediate reaction. It's going to follow the local procedures. Maybe there will be a trial. At least, people will be consulted. The family will be consulted. There will be a decision that will be made. And the retaliation will be very targeted. So either you might try to ostracize or to kill in some cases the culprit. Even in things like that seem quite barbaric to us, like honor crimes. There's a logic to it that is very well respected, and that follows some kind of intuitions people have about who should be punished and why. By contrast, when you have a reflective belief in the wrongdoing, so in the cases of the blood libel, for instance, in most of the time nothing happens, and that's one of the most remarkable things. So if you follow the history of the blood libel, so the idea that Jews capture and kill a Christian child to drink their blood, at Passover, that belief has persisted throughout the Middle Ages. And even though it has accompanied, all too many pogroms, it was also present when people were doing nothing against the local Jewish population, which is pretty absurd. Like, imagine having your neighbors and you think they tend to kill your children and drink their blood, and most of the time you do nothing about it. So that's kind of weird. And when people do engage in ethnic violence, the violence is completely unrelated to the accusation. So, for instance, in one of the well-studied pogrom in Kishinev in the early 20th century, when people attacked the Jewish population, they would pillage, they would steal from the shop. I mean, actually, the shops selling kind of wine and alcohol were typically the first victims. They would rape the women. They would murder, kind of weak people, which has no bearing whatsoever on the crimes that the Jewish people were accused of. So then again, I think we have a very strong contrast between what happens when people intuitively believe that a crime has been committed because they have witnessed it themselves or because they have reliable evidence, or when people reflectively believe that a crime has been committed because some rumors are circulating, for instance, and the behavioral patterns and the emotional patterns are extremely different in both cases. So that was the first type of evidence that a belief has held reflectively, is that you have a very different kind of emotional, cognitive, and behavioral patterns between the intuitive and the reflective beliefs. And most cultural misbeliefs are accompanied by this, this kind of reflective belief pattern rather than intuitive belief pattern. And the other type of evidence I want to muster is when we observe in many different cultures across the world the same behavior, but it is accompanied by different beliefs, or even in some cases by no beliefs at all. And so I would suggest that when that is the case, the behavior is the primary thing that causes the belief. So you have, many things will cause people to behave in a certain manner, and then sometimes they will make stuff up to accompany the behavior. But the fact that you have the same behavior with many different beliefs suggests that it is not the beliefs that are causing the behavior. So the case that I've studied the most, because it's really fun, is the example of bloodletting. So bloodletting is the practice of letting a bit of blood out to cure any kind of ailment, really, depending on the culture. And in many ways, it could be seen as the poster child for a cultural misbelief that has some seriously costly consequences. So in that kind of traditional story, you have the humoral theory of disease that was propounded by Galen and other ancient physicians that survived, throughout the early Middle Ages up to the early modern period. And according to that theory, health and disease are mostly determined by the balance between four humors. One of these humors is blood. And the best way of controlling health and making sure people don't get sick or fighting diseases is to take out a bit of blood. And so that was widely popular, then again, throughout most European and early American history. And it had indeed very costly consequences, maybe one of the most famous being the death of George Washington, who was taken ill with a throat infection in the winter of 1799. And the best doctors of the day were brought to his bedside, and they proceeded to drain him of 2.5 liters of blood, which is about half his blood. After which he died, kind of rather unsurprisingly. So then again, it seems as if we have the great case of cultural misbeliefs, so this misbelief in the humoral theory of disease, causing some very costly behavior. But in fact, that's kind of something quite well known by anthropologists. But we did it kind of more formally with Elena Mitton and Nicolas Clédière. We did just a basic survey of HRAF, the anthropological database, looking at where bloodletting is practiced. And it turns out that somewhere maybe like a third of the world's cultures have practiced or still practice bloodletting. And obviously, essentially none of them have ever heard of Galen or the humoral theory of disease. Many of them have just no theory at all for why they practice bloodletting. They just do it and they think, oh, it's good, we do it. And sometimes they will say, well, we're just going to take bad stuff out. But that's about it in most cases. So what that shows is that clearly the humoral theory of disease is not what causes the success of bloodletting in the West. And instead, for reasons that I can go into later if you'd like, but are a bit tangential here, drawing a bit of blood to cure an ailment is an intuitive practice that spontaneously evolves in most or in many human societies, and that causes in some cultures the emergence of the reflective belief in the humoral theory of disease as a way of justifying this practice. Because if you live in a very kind of fancy, advanced culture, you can't have people just cutting people up. You need to have a theory for why they should be cut up. And indeed, the causal influence of that reflective belief in the humoral theory of disease is quite small. So it plays some role in kind of what diseases can be treated or how bloodletting should be practiced. But the gist of the causal power goes from the practice to the theory and not the other way around. Another example is opposition to vaccination. So in that graph, you see the share of people who, so these are all different countries, who strongly agree in green, neither strongly agree nor strongly disagree, so they don't really know in blue, or strongly disagree that vaccines are safe. So what you can see is that reassuringly, people who really are against vaccination are there's not many of them in most countries. I mean, France is a sad outlier there. But even in France, we're at kind of 5–10%. So in most countries, you have a few percent of people who are strongly anti-vax. That has been true since the very inception of inoculation and vaccination and the first attempts at forcing people to be vaccinated in early modern England. And that that seems to be true everywhere. So the exact share of people who are opposed will vary a bit, but you will always have a core of people who are opposed. And you will always have many more people who are hesitant than there should be given the evidence available. And so, that's one of the cases in which it seems as if you take one country, like if you take the US or the UK, well, people will think, well, it's partly because of Wakefield's disastrous, and fraudulent study that has led people to think that vaccination causes autism. But in fact, you have the same pattern everywhere. And indeed, the excuses, the reasons that people invoke to justify their refusal to vaccinate vary very, very widely across the world. They're all equally bad, but they vary widely, which suggests then again that you have the same pattern in which people have an intuitive belief for many reasons that vaccination is harmful, and that intuitive belief or that intuitive reaction to the practice then causes or explains the success of the reflective beliefs like vaccination causes autism, but the reflective beliefs have relatively little causal power over the intuitive belief. What much time do I have? Oh, cool. Another example that I'm really gonna this is very hand wavy, but I think they're quite they all go in the same direction. Another example is radicalization. So one of the main theories of radicalization, in particular of kind of religious radicalization, was put forward by Kryglenski, Belanger, and Gunnar Hatna, sorry. And it's the 303N theory of needs, narratives, and networks. And then again, so, if you look across the world, it looks as if you have people who radicalize towards very, very different beliefs. So you have, radical far-right groups, radical Muslims, radical communists, radical all sorts of things. And many of them the most radical groups will tend to engage in some forms of violence. But their argument is that in all of these cases, the root cause of the radicalization is the need that preexists in the individuals that will become radicalized, a need that is essentially created by an extreme lack of status and recognition, people who feel that they do not have at all the status within the community that they should have, and they're really smart and they're not, their intelligence isn't recognized, et cetera. And then the specific forum or the specific beliefs that will be endorsed depends on whatever narrative is most prevalent in a given cultural sphere, and what networks are the most powerful. So who are the people most likely to get in? Who are these people who have the right needs, the most likely to get into contact? And so that will shape the specific beliefs that these radicalized people will hold. But the fact that they will radicalize and that they will engage in violent action is really kind of crucially dependent on the need rather than the narrative, which is more like an habillage, like some fancy dress up that justifies then again the underlying motivation. And I mean, you can also see that in the fact that typically, at least in kind of Islamic terrorism, the people who are engaging in that were not very religious at all to start with. So it's not as if you start from very religious beliefs and then you come to become radicalized. You start from some personal need, and then you adopt the beliefs that will justify your actions. You find the same pattern broadly in religious conversions, and there's a lot of work in the rational choice theory of religion that is really, I think, helpful for that. And then again, across the world, we see, very, very different religious beliefs in these new religious movements, ranging all the way from sociology, sorry, Scientology, sorry about that, to Mormonism, et cetera, the Moon Church. But it seems as if in all of these cases, what explains the appeal of these new religious movements is that they provide the people who join them a sense of community and social support that they welcome. And studies of religious conversions towards these movements have shown that conversion typically happens through social ties. So people convert because they see their family and their friends starting to converting to these new religions, and the beliefs only come after. So okay, well, if everybody is going to the new Mormon church, I'm going to go there and I'm going to adopt the same beliefs about the Church of the Latter-day Saints. But the beliefs very rarely drive the conversion. It's really the other way around. How much time do I have? Yeah, I'm gonna skip that bit anyway. So the point I've been making is that first, that it's possible for people to have these reflective beliefs. So they really believe in something, and yet the belief has essentially, either it has no impact on their thoughts and behaviors, or it has kind of indirect impacts on their thoughts and behaviors that are quite different from the impact it would have if it were held intuitively. I've argued that there's quite a bit of evidence, even if it's a bit hand-wavy at that stage, that a lot of cultural misbeliefs are indeed reflective beliefs, so that they do not cause all the costly behaviors that have been associated with them. And then the question becomes, why do we have these cultural misbeliefs at all? Why don't people just do the bad things or the costly things they want to do? Why do they encumber themselves with all of that, all of these cultural beliefs, all these cultural misbeliefs? So I have 2 minutes, so I'll go quickly. One of the main reasons, I think, is that cultural misbeliefs are often used as justifications for actions one wanted to undertake anyway. So I think that's quite that's quite clearly the case in things like the humoral theory for bloodletting. So, clearly Galen, he scored a lot of points by making up these very kind of elaborate theories that would justify the kind of medical practices that people were happy to engage in anyway. Another way that these cultural misbeliefs can be useful is that they can signal one's affiliation. So if you take the most extreme forms of conspiracy theories against Democrats, for instance, they can be used to signal that you're a very strong kind of pro-Trump supporter. That's something that Dan Williams, for instance, has worked on recently, kind of burning bridges type of beliefs. And they can also be used as coordination mechanisms. So, for instance, the kind of rumors that circulate before ethnic riots, I don't think they play a direct causal role, and indeed, there's strong evidence that that's not the case. But it's quite useful if you want to see whether other people are ready and willing to attack a minority. You can see how they react when you tell them, well, look, they've done this horrible thing, and if they say, oh yeah, no, they really, we have to do something about it, or if you start sharing these horrible rumors of atrocities with the authorities, and the authorities are like, oh yeah, maybe they did it, then it's a sign that they're not going to do anything to stop you from attacking them. So these cultural misbeliefs, they play a number of roles, and indeed I would argue that they're quite useful for the people who hold them in most cases, but they don't have the direct behavioral consequences that we tend to attribute to them. So to conclude very quickly, so humans can hold beliefs reflectively. Reflective beliefs do not have the same effects on our thoughts or emotions or behaviors as intuitive beliefs. And as a rule, the effects tend to be weaker for reflective than for intuitive beliefs. Most cultural misbeliefs do not have the effect that the same beliefs would have if they were held intuitively. They have a number of effects that the intuitive beliefs wouldn't have, like someone who believes in a conspiracy theory and who shouts that from the rooftops. The cultural misbeliefs vary widely across cultures, even if the underlying or the costly behavior doesn't vary at all. And so I would argue that a lot of them, if not possibly most of them, are reflective beliefs. So why does that matter? Well, I think it has interesting theoretical consequences. One is that it means that humans are much less gullible than it might seem. Because if it were the case that humans would accept these really completely misguided beliefs, and as a result of that, they would engage in extremely kind of costly for themselves and for others behavior that would make them really gullible. And I have argued at length in the book that you kindly pointed earlier that they are not, so that it's good for me. That also has, I think, quite important practical consequences in the sense that if we want to fight costly behaviors, addressing the accompanying misbeliefs is likely to be quite ineffective. So even if you convince someone, and there's actually like a lot of studies now showing that. So it's quite easy to convince people, let's say, who hold crazy beliefs about Democrats that these things are wrong, but it's not going to change their underlying attitudes and who they're going to vote for. Instead, the root causes of the problematic behaviors must be addressed. So we can't, and that's a much harder thing. Like we can't fool ourselves into thinking that just getting rid of the misbeliefs is going to get rid of the behaviors. And one case in which we can see that is conspiracy theories, because like the only thing that really works against conspiracy theories is to have a less corrupt government. But that's hard. That's much harder than trying to shut down a YouTube channel. But that's the only thing we can really do if we want to properly solve the problem. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our speaker. Here's the part where you have to imagine the thunderous applause since we're all on Zoom. But thank you so much, Hugo. That was terrific. So as Neil mentioned at the beginning, our format for the questions is that I'm going to encourage those of you who have questions to write them into chat. And then either I'll read your question out or I'll ask you to unmute to share your question. So hopefully,
am I still showing the slide? I'm not showing my screen anymore, am I?
That's right. You've taken them down for now. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, looks good. So again, those of you with questions, I encourage you to go ahead and write them into chat. And I'm going to abuse the privilege of chairing questions and ask a question while the rest of you get your thoughts together. I have a lot of questions, actually. There's so much rich material here. So I guess I have two, but I'll start with one of them, and then if there's time for the other one. So you made this really interesting contrast between the kinds of cases you're talking about, like these political misbeliefs and so on, that don't rest on counterintuitive concepts themselves, and the religious cases that do rest on counterintuitive concepts. And so you pointed out this puzzle, which at least I see as a puzzle, but I'm not yet sure what the answer is, which is why don't those become intuitive beliefs, right? I mean, in the religious case, it seems like we have a relatively straightforward story about why there's challenges to them becoming intuitive. But for those cases, what's blocking the process of them just translating into straightforward intuitive beliefs?
So that's a great question, and I'm not sure exactly I know what the answer is, but my intuition is that in some ways the epistemic vigilance mechanisms we have to evaluate communication are still doing their job well enough that even though people will accept the belief enough to profess them, they won't accept them enough to act on them. And so in a way, that's the like a good contrast is like with rumors. So if you like an example I like is there was in Orléans, this town in France, there was a rumors that that Jewish shopkeepers were abducting women and sending them into sexual slavery. And a lot of people in the town believed that, or they were sharing the rumor with others, and they were acting a little bit worried. But my sense is that they didn't really, I mean, they still knew in some ways that their sources were not reliable. And that by contrast, if they had like one of their friends, run out of the store saying, well, this guy just tried to grab me, they would have acted very differently. So they, they know to people know to make the difference between, someone telling them something that they think might be true and someone being a reliable witness. What I think what's striking, I think it explains well why these beliefs remain reflective. And what's interesting then is why do people profess them so strongly? Because I think on some level, they're not very confidently held, but they think, no, I'm really sure it's true. And so the gap really, I think, is between how they're active, really held in their cognitive, in their mind, and what they're saying about them. And I think there is an interesting gap, which I think is mostly unconscious. People don't realize that they're not very confidently held. And they still say that. So I don't know exactly what's going on there.
Thanks. I'm going to resist follow-ups and instead go to our queue. So we have first Eric Mandelbaum. I'm going to ask you to unmute and go ahead and ask your question.
Thanks. So I'm totally unclear on what the status is for quantifying behaviors, because all the things that you're saying as kind of reflective behaviors, reflective beliefs, seem like there's a lot of behaviors that are going along with them. So, the people who believe that vaccines cause autism do things like say vaccines cause autism. They tweet about it. They go to the state house. They protest. They don't vaccinate children. And those seem like behaviors. And for all of the things that seem like they were reflective beliefs, there just seemed like there were higher level behaviors, ones that are kind of harder to quantify. So you said for small societies, if you thought somebody broke something, or if you thought somebody was really murderous or dangerous, you do something. In these huge societies, what are you going to do if you think, that there's climate change that's happening, or if you think that that we have a problem with too many guns? It's unclear what somebody could do in those situations. So I was wondering what you were thinking for the actual problem, how to quantify what counts as behavior or not behavior.
No, that's a great question. So for instance, if you the example you took of people believing that vaccines cause autism, the argument I would make is that you can tell which part is caused really by the belief and which part isn't by looking at how people behave who don't have the same belief. So we can see across the world people who do not believe that vaccines cause autism, and yet they resist vaccination and they don't want their children to be vaccinated. So it seems as if that specific belief doesn't play a strong kind of causal role in explaining that specific behavior. By contrast, you're right that, if you want to explain why someone says and, tweets about vaccines causing autism, clearly you need to have the belief that vaccines cause autism to do that. But if you want to understand why people, why that belief causes that specific behavior, I think it's better explained if you think that that belief is used to justify not vaccinating your children, for instance, or to mark yourself as someone who's strongly anti-vax and to show that you belong to a community, then that explains nicely why people would be so keen on communicating that belief. And so I think you can sort of tell, depending on what the specific cognitive mechanism is that the belief interacts with. So if you have a reflexive belief, most likely it will interact with things that are about signaling, versus if it's an intuitive belief, it will be just about your own behavior. And the second question is, so unfortunately I think that, so I've said that my talk is kind of optimistic because look at all these cultural misbeliefs, maybe it's not that big of a deal. But unfortunately, I think that's also true for a lot of cultural beliefs. So the fact that many people believe that climate change is happening and that it's terrible and that it's man-made, but I think for most people, there's also a very reflective belief, partly because we don't have intuitive concepts about climate change and what to do about it. And so most people will hold the belief and they will say that it's really bad, but they won't do anything about it, in the same way as they can hold cultural misbeliefs and also not do anything about it. So the flip side of the coin is that that's also true for correct beliefs, unfortunately.
So that actually happened to answer another great question that was in the chat by Kara Weissman, exactly about that other relationship between beliefs not leading to action. I want to bundle two questions that we have here. So Dan Williams and Zoe Jenkin are both hoping you can say more about the intuitive reflective belief distinction, and in particular, how sharp that distinction is. Is it really as categorical as it might seem? And why is that, how is that specific distinction, what are the advantages of that specific distinction for understanding the compartmentalization of belief?
So that's a great question. In a way, there's one sense in which the distinction is quite strict, in the sense that at any given time, a given belief can be held either intuitively or reflectively, and you can do both. You can, I can see that there's a window in front of me, and I have an intuitive belief there's a window in front of me, and I can also, if I want from the reflexive belief, look, I can see that there's a window in front of me. So people can do that, but a lot of beliefs can go back and forth, and so you can have a belief that can become intuitive, at least in part, and then you think about it, you take a more reflective attitude towards it, or you can try, if you're things like, for instance, when you learn mathematics, a lot of beliefs that were really reflective about numbers, and they at first it seems very abstract and you don't really understand what's going on. Then you form intuitions about even numbers themselves, because obviously in cultures that don't have numbers, people can't count after 4 intuitively, and yet people can develop intuitions. They can learn to have intuitions about something that was reflective when you learned it. So these things are quite fluid if you look at things through development or even across time, shorter time spans. But at any given time, you should be able to tell whether it's more intuitive or reflective mechanisms that are at play.
I'm gonna jump to a question that's sort of a follow-up, because it's also about this distinction. So Jonathan Zhang says, with respect to whether or not reflective beliefs lead to intuitive ones, you said that some don't, because the reflective beliefs don't rely on basic intuitions. So if he's not mistaken, Sperber's view is that it's because those reflective beliefs are, roughly speaking, contentless. So it sounds like your view and Sperber's might be different. So I'm curious if you could just elaborate on, do you see a difference there? And if so, what is it?
Well, so that relates to the question you were raising initially, Tanya. I think the point I'm making, which is that it is possible for beliefs to be reflective, even though they only involve intuitive concepts, is a point that I don't think, if I remember correctly, I don't think Dan made in that paper, but it's not contrary to anything he's saying in that paper. He's not saying that the only reason why a belief would remain reflective is that it involves reflective concepts. It's just I don't think he has elaborated on cases in which you have these reflective beliefs that remain reflective even though the concepts are intuitive.
Another question I think relates to something you said a moment ago, and I suspect you agree, but I'll ask it. This is from Andrew Chignell. So based on what you said, I think you agree with this, but he raises the question of whether or not there could be feedback loops. So you might have situations where a particular cultural misbelief sort of strengthens what might have been weak in a population otherwise, which then in turn sort of like a feedback loop, so that these strengthen each other.
Yes, no, I mean, there can be a lot of bad effects of cultural misbeliefs, and so one of them, for instance, that has been kind of well studied is the case of anti-Semitic propaganda in Nazi Germany. And so what seems to have happened there is that a lot of Germans were already highly anti-Semitic and quite happy to act on their anti-Semitic beliefs, but they didn't do it before the Nazis took power because they thought that this would be, frowned upon, or the government would take action against them. But when they could see that actually a lot of people were sharing these anti-Semitic beliefs and that the government was behind them, then they acted on these anti-Semitic beliefs. And a lot of how that happened is through cultural misbeliefs, like obviously kind of wrongful accusations against Jewish people that were used by the government and by other anti-Semites to signal that they were there and that they were powerful and that they were on the same side. And so even though the beliefs, and again, don't directly cause the behavior, they play some damaging role nonetheless.
I think we'll manage to get to 2 more questions maybe, if I'll encourage everyone to be succinct here. But David, Kinney, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself if you want to ask your question.
Thanks. So I just want to ask very quickly, in thinking about the sort of cultural universality of bloodletting, it just made me think generally that there are certain sort of aspects of like having a body or being embodied that seem to cause the kinds of intuitive beliefs that would justify certain folk medical practices. Sorry, I'm in a crowded area. You think you have a really bad headache and you think, oh, I'd just like to let this tension out, and that would seem to justify something like trepanning. Or when you're really ill, there's just this sense of wanting to get the bad stuff out. Maybe this is an idiosyncratic experience of mine, but I suggest it's not. The comment about feedback loops makes me think that I'm already bringing in some of the more kind of reflective cultural beliefs that I've been exposed to, but I wonder sort of how do you see those lines of causality going? Because it seems like some of these experiences are fairly universal for humans.
Yes, no, I completely agree then. And indeed, beyond bloodletting, the other forms of therapies that you find throughout the world are forms of getting stuff out. So you have laxatives, emetics, sedation. Trepanation is, fortunately rarer, but it happens as well. So yeah, my story very briefly is that on the one hand, people have an intuition that the things that come out of your body are bad. We have disgust psychology. Anything that comes out of the body is kind of disgusting. And so people would quite intuitively think that if something has come out of their body and that afterwards they feel better, it is because the bad thing has come out of their body that they feel better. And they intuitively establish a causal link between them throwing up or going to the bathroom or even bleeding and then feeling better afterwards. And then once they have this causal link in place, then when the next time they will try to kind of make the bad thing go out more kind of directly. But they'll try to do it themselves instead of just kind of waiting for the bad thing to passively come out.
For the last question, I'm going to ask Eric Schwitzgable if you want to ask your question yourself, or I can read it out.
I can ask. I guess I'm wondering to what extent. All right. I'm not feeling like there's a sharp distinction between these kinds of things, and I was wondering if a lot of the cases where there seems to be a distinction between the reflective belief and the intuitive belief are cases where they're just different surrounding beliefs, right? So like in the conspiracy cases, sometimes it's very dangerous and sometimes it's not so dangerous to speak the truth. And, to what extent could those, your surrounding beliefs be explaining what's going on? I mean, maybe not in all of the cases you said, but I think maybe in some of the cases it seems like that could be explanatory. I was also thinking about the climate change case, which you just described as a reflective belief, right? But it could be that people have surrounding beliefs like, well, there's not much that I can personally do about it. Harking back to Eric Mandelbaum's earlier comment, right? Maybe I don't want to make sacrifices if I don't see other people making the same sacrifices. At the same time, I kind of, I expect that the climate will get hotter and the seas will rise. It seems like I just kind of believe it in an ordinary way. So I'm wondering whether you're overplaying the distinction a little bit, and a lot of what might be going on with the extent to which people implement or fail to implement things you might think would follow from their beliefs has to do with the surrounding attitudes that they have.
Yeah, no, that's an alternative possibility. So like, yeah, I mean, I think my like a methodological issue I would have with that is that people really want to be coherent. And so let's say if you take a conspiracy theorist and you point out to them, well, look, you have a blog in which you write that the CIA is responsible for 9/11. Like, aren't you worried that they're going to get you? And I'm sure they're going to make something up to justify that being coherent. And then you could say, well, look, they had this other belief that explains why it's coherent for them to. But I think they will have made that shit up after the fact instead of the belief being there beforehand. So I think there's a risk of if you are going that way of making it seem as if people are perfectly coherent and they're not taking action because they have good reasons for not taking actions, when in fact, no, they just don't have the intuitive belief in the first place. So I agree that it's, in some cases it will be what you're describing, but I would want to be very cautious about making sure that people did have the beliefs beforehand that they need to have for the belief to not lead to behavior, and that these beliefs aren't just made up after the fact.
Unfortunately, we should wrap up, but I want to take one more moment to, as Neil did at the beginning, acknowledge the John Templeton Foundation that's funded this series and made it possible. And again, thank our speaker for today's presentation and all of you for great questions. Thanks again.
Cool.